At 3:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the world as we knew it ended, not with a bang, but with a flash flood of impossible scale. In a single silent moment, an area larger than France and Spain combined vanished from the American heartland, replaced by a saltwater sea. The Mississippi now pours into an ocean born overnight, and tsunamis are racing toward London and Tokyo at the same time. Sleeping families in Kansas City woke to empty air where their homes once stood. As global communication networks blink out one by one, humanity is left facing the unthinkable. Reality itself is broken, and nothing will ever be the same. Okay, so I saw that the Mount Rushmore of alt history channels tag-teamed on this topic. Like it was WrestleMania Mediterranean Sea or something. So I decided to enter the ring. I tried to go down a different road. Let's see where we'll end up. Hour 0. The rupture began without warning. There was no tremor, no distant rumble, just an abrupt and universal silence. Inside the United States Geological Survey, technicians stared at their screens as every seismograph on Earth flat-lined at once. The constant, subtle hum of the planet's crust simply vanished. In this hypothetical scenario, the sheer physics are staggering. An area larger than France and Spain combined was physically scooped out of existence, replaced by a vast inland sea. This wasn't a flood. It was a swap. Trillions of tons of rock, soil, and mantle were gone in an instant, exchanged for salt water. The planet responded with a violent global jolt. Losing such a massive chunk of continental mass in a nanosecond caused Earth's rotation to lurch. There was no epicenter, no gradual buildup, just a sickening planet-wide shift. People everywhere, from Tokyo to London, felt the sudden change, even if they couldn't name it. But what triggered it? No quake, no volcano, nothing our scientists had ever recorded. This event unleashed a seismic shockwave, unlike any in history. Instead of radiating from a single point, the shock wave erupted along the entire edge of the new American Mediterranean, forming a ring of pure kinetic energy stretching nearly 1,000 miles. The ground didn't just shake. It warped. The new Madrid seismic zone, once buried deep in the continent, was now exposed as a ragged, unstable coastline. The sudden stress on this fault line twisted the Earth, priming it for a series of aftershocks that would dwarf anything previously measured. The crust groaned, strained by forces it was never meant to endure. At the boundary where land met the new sea, chaos took hold. Fields in Kansas became sheer cliffs, dropping into churning, steaming water. The friction from the event generated intense heat, and satellites recorded an anomalous glow radiating from the new seabed. Infrastructure, highways, railroads, pipelines, was severed abruptly, ending in mid-air above a vast abyss. The Mississippi River, its old route erased, now plunged over a newly formed precipice, carving a violent canyon as it emptied into the unfamiliar ocean. The air reacted just as violently. The instantaneous appearance of the sea created a sudden vacuum, and the surrounding atmosphere rushed in to fill the gap. The collision of superheated air with the cold front of the new sea caused an explosive expansion. The result wasn't a typical sound, but a single deafening thunderclap, one with the force of thousands of nuclear detonations. The shock wave traveled across the continent, shattering windows in Miami and Toronto at the same moment. For millions, this was the first tangible evidence that something unimaginable had happened. Sensors and monitoring systems worldwide struggled to process the event. Gravity-sensing satellites showed a massive loss of mass in North America. GPS satellites returned errors, unable to locate ground stations that no longer existed. At NORA, the map itself appeared to fail. showing a hole in the heart of the country. The data was so contradictory. A seismic event without an epicenter, a gravitational anomaly, and a communications blackout that officials suspected total system failure. To the outside world, it looked as if the central United States had simply been deleted. For anyone within the affected area, there was no warning, no sensation, only sudden non-existence. The catastrophe wasn't the ground shaking or the winds howling, but the abrupt transition from being to nothingness. For the rest of the world, the first sign wasn't a siren. It was the simultaneous failure of every sophisticated monitoring system, all at once. Yet the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to reveal itself. The sudden appearance of a sea in North America had consequences far beyond the continent's edge. The drowning wave arrived as the world reeled from the unimaginable. The water that filled the new American Sea didn't come from nowhere. It was stolen all at once from the planet's existing oceans. In an instant, the oceans seemed to be sucked dry, their surfaces dropping at a rate no one had ever witnessed. Off New York Harbor, the water receded so quickly that the Statue of Liberty stood over a muddy plain, the exposed seabed stretching for miles. Ships found themselves stranded, their hulls scraping bottom where deep water had been minutes before. For those on the decks of vessels suddenly exposed to the sky, the greatest danger was not knowing a mountain of water was bearing down on them. This sudden, global drawdown was the first sign of the disaster. The oceans didn't empty evenly. Water rushed away from some coasts and left others nearly unchanged, depending on the shape of the sea floor and the direction of the initial pull. In places like the English Channel, ferries sat tilted in the mud, their passengers staring in confusion at a horizon that had retreated out of reach. But this eerie calm lasted only moments. The true threat was what came next. The vacuum created by the missing water triggered a planetary-scale slosh. The oceans, pulled violently out of balance, snapped back. This wasn't a gentle return. It was a series of tsunamis, each one larger than anything in recorded history, racing for the coasts at the speed of a jetliner. The Atlantic, hemmed in by continents, became a chaotic echo chamber. Instead of a single wave, it produced a tangled train of swells, each rebounding between North America, Europe, and Africa. The water didn't just move. It surged in a series of liquid walls, each one capable of destroying entire cities. Imagine the crew of the Evergreen Apex, a container ship caught in the middle of the Atlantic during the first swell. One moment, the ship rose on a smooth and possibly vast hill of water, high enough to see the fractured American coastline to the west and the distant outline of Portugal to the east. And just as quickly, the vessel slid down into a trough so deep it seemed to vanish, swallowed by the next oncoming wave. For everyone at sea, survival depended on luck alone. The Pacific's response was even more severe. With its immense size and unobstructed expanse, the slosh there generated a single massive wall of water. It moved silently, a dark ridge taller than skyscrapers, sweeping toward the most densely populated coastlines in the world: Japan, the Philippines, and the eastern seaboard of China. In Tokyo, people watched the bay empty in minutes, ships left listing on mudflats. Then, the horizon darkened as the wave approached. There was no warning. Communications had already failed, and the means to alert anyone were destroyed at the source. The first impacts struck minutes after the sea appeared in North America. The brand new coastline of the American Mediterranean was battered by internal waves, but the old coast suffered even worse. Along the United States Atlantic shore, from Maine to the now isolated tip of Florida, the first rebound wave hit with crushing force. At nearly the same moment, the western coasts of Ireland and Portugal were inundated by the same unstoppable surge. In Lisbon, the water swept through the city so fast and with such power that entire neighborhoods were erased in silence. Warning systems failed across the globe. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center detected the seismic anomaly, but its alerts went nowhere. Undersea cables had been severed by the shifting crust, and satellite networks were too disrupted to relay messages. Cities that had always trusted their technology to protect them were defenseless. These were not isolated disasters. This was a global event, and for every coastal population, there was no time to react. The devastation didn't end at landfall. The force of the waves pushed water miles inland, destroying infrastructure and erasing coastlines. Ecosystems collapsed, and the loss of life was immediate and overwhelming. The world's largest cities, built at the water's edge, became unrecognizable. As the floodwaters surged and receded, the planet's attention shifted. While the oceans battered the shores, a new and stranger threat was building overhead. Comment below what is the craziest part of this story yet? How does it compare to Mount Rushmore of YouTube alternate history content creators? The transformation of North America's climate began the moment the new sea appeared. Where there had been a stable, predictable pattern of seasons, there was now a massive, churning body of warm salt water at the continent's center. The familiar blue sky faded behind thick, roiling clouds as the atmosphere tried to adjust to this sudden, impossible change. The heat radiating from the sea created a powerful updraft, drawing moist air upward in a column miles wide. Surrounding land, still cold from late winter, pressed in with dense, dry air. The collision wasn't gradual. It was instant and violent. In our scenario, this clash birthed a storm system like nothing in recorded history. A forever hurricane, anchored over the plains, constantly fueled by the vast, warm reservoir below. Cities beneath this new weather engine soon found themselves trapped under a perpetual cyclone. The sky was never still. Lightning arced across the clouds in endless flickers, turning night into a strobe-lit haze. Thunder rolled in an unbroken wave, a background roar that rattled windows and nerves alike. Could 30 million people live under that relentless roar night after night? Sleep became impossible, nerves frayed, and the sense of normalcy was erased. For those who survived the initial disaster, the psychological toll of a sky that never quieted was immediate and severe. As the cyclone churned, it began to draw in air from every direction, pulling cold fronts from the north and humid air from the south. The jet stream, which once guided weather gently across the continent, fractured as it collided with a new thermal barrier. Instead of flowing smoothly, it broke apart into chaotic eddies. One branch plunged south, dragging Arctic air into places like Dallas, where blizzards buried palm trees and highways in snowdrifts. Another branch shot north, carrying tropical moisture deep into Canada, where sudden flash floods swept through towns still thawing from winter. The old rules of climate no longer applied. Forecasts failed, and weather maps became unreadable. The evaporation rate from the sea was staggering. Billions of tons of water vapor rose each day, thickening the air and fueling the permanent storm. Rain fell in sheets, not just on the new coastline but far beyond, carving gullies into the land and turning fields to toxic swamps. These weren't ordinary rains, these were toxic downpours, picking up chemicals from the freshly exposed seabed and depositing them across the interior. Rivers overflowed, and what had once been farmland became a marshy wasteland. Meteorologists, watching from battered offices and makeshift command centers, saw their models collapse. Weather prediction was now impossible. Computer screens flickered with impossible colors, maps redrawing themselves every few seconds as the continent's climate spun beyond comprehension. The idea of planning for tomorrow's weather became a memory. Instead, survival depended on reacting to whatever the sky brought in the next hour. The chaos didn't stop at the continent's edge. The fractured jet stream and the constant injection of heat and moisture into the atmosphere began to disrupt weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. Europe, Asia, and even Africa felt the ripple effects. Unseasonal storms, sudden freezes, and flash floods in places that had never seen them before. The planet's climate, finely balanced for thousands of years, was now in free fall. As the skies raged and the storm's roar became a constant companion, another crisis was unfolding. One that was quieter, but in many ways more terrifying. Inside Cheyenne Mountain, the NORAD command center was lit only by the glow of its main tactical display. It was a normal night, until 3:15 a.m., when a single red icon blinked over Missouri, signaling a lost ground station. No one had time to react before another appeared, then a dozen more, and within seconds, a flood of red swept across the board. Every satellite, radar, and communication hub in the heart of the continent vanished from the map in a matter of moments. The display flickered, then went black. In the stunned silence, a general's voice cut through. "Where the hell are our satellites?" There was no answer. There was nothing left to see. The great silence had begun, not just in one bunker or city, but everywhere at once. Fiber cables tore apart beneath the waves, snapped by the shifting crust and scoured by tsunamis. These cables carried almost every word, image, and transaction between continents. Their destruction didn't just slow the internet. It severed the world's nervous system. Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas became isolated, each trapped in its own bubble of confusion. The usual flow of news, money, and instructions stopped mid-sentence. Global markets froze. Banks and trading floors, dependent on instant communication, became useless overnight. For ordinary people, the silence was immediate and total. Phones rang without connecting. Television screens froze on emergency signals, then cut to static. Radios hissed with nothing but noise. The emergency alert system, designed to cut through any crisis, failed because its backbone was gone. Leaders tried to issue orders, but their voices vanished into dead air. There were no updates, no warnings, no way to check on family or friends, even a few miles away. The uncertainty was a new kind of terror, more paralyzing than the storms or the floods. People gathered around powerless devices, hoping for a sign that never came. The confusion in command centers deepened. The initial suspicion was a massive attack. Nuclear, cyber, or both. But the facts didn't fit. There was no epicenter, no single point of failure. The loss of contact wasn't spreading outward. It was happening everywhere. The generals and analysts, trained to respond to threats, found their entire system of response useless. Procedures written for war or disaster had no place in this new reality. Orders couldn't be given or received. The chain of command dissolved into whispers and questions. Only one person above it all saw the full scope. An astronaut on the International Space Station watched as the world changed in real time. She saw the heart of North America replaced by a glowing sea, lightning flickering through a permanent cyclone. She watched as city after city went dark, first along the American coasts, then across Europe and Asia. The lights blinked out not from battle, but from the collapse of everything that kept civilization running. From above, the transformation was absolute. A planet remade, its patterns of life erased. On the ground, the consequences multiplied. With no way to coordinate, emergency services faltered. Hospitals lost access to distant specialists and supply chains. Airports became silent, planes grounded with no instructions. The financial system, built on the promise of instant connection, crashed. People lined up at banks that couldn't process transactions. Supermarkets emptied, unable to restock or take electronic payments. Every system that depended on distant information failed in the same instant. In the bunkers and shelters, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not an attack, not a disaster that could be fixed with time or technology. The world's rules had changed, and everything familiar had vanished. The silence was not just the absence of noise. It was the loss of connection, of certainty, of the world as it had been. Somewhere, across the static of a battery-powered radio, a single voice called out, "Is anyone there? Can anyone hear me?" There was no reply. The silence was complete, and the future was unwritten. In a single moment, the map was rewritten, and the rules of existence were erased. There's no reset button. This world has been remade. Humanity's history ended at 3:14 a.m., and the age of survival began. Like the great collapses of the ancient world, this is a clean slate, but on a global scale. Survivors are left with only the knowledge of a world that's forever gone. Humanity now inherits a planet we'll never fully understand. Our fight has just begun. What would you do if the rules of nature disappeared overnight? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more far-out alternate history stories. And make sure you check out the links to the original gangsters of alternative history here on YouTube.